Kyrgyzstan isn't a country most cinephiles think of when discussing or exploring foreign cinema. A landlocked nation with less than 7 million inhabitants, surrounded by China and other independent Central Asia states like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, it is a stunningly beautiful, predominantly mountainous country with rich and ancient culture and customs that has for a long time remained rather inconspicuous in the world stage. Having belonged to one of the most distant and neglected ends of the Soviet Union for most of the 20th century, likely played a part in keeping it somewhat secluded from the probing external eyes. Yet amidst this apparent international concealment, a vibrant, exciting wave of inventive, in fact enforcing domestic strand of cinema, inspired by the works of one of the greatest writers in history, was brewing and bubbling effervescently throughout the 60s and 70s, a time which is nowadays recollected as the golden age of cinema in the country. This video is about a film that galvanized and effectively kickstarted that ebullient artistic movement, a work which bears therefore particular significance for various reasons, which shall be explored in the upcoming minutes, so stay tuned for another trip into international cinematic history. The most artistically accomplished and successful period in Kyrgyz cinema, lasting from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, encompasses a varied range of films that attained great renown at home, but which are also broadly considered as part of the distinctive Soviet filmmaking sphere by many academics. During this time, directors such as Tolomush Okeyev, Bolotebek Shamshiev, Melis, Ubukeyev and Gennady Bazarov, four of the most representative filmmakers in Kyrgyz history, produced their first films and key works that would forever define the country's cinematography. Usually, two films are mentioned as being responsible for putting the country on the map: The First Teacher by Andrei Konchalovsky and The Sky of Our Childhood by Tolomush Okeyev from 1965 and 1966 respectively. The former has been irregularly labeled as a Soviet-Russian film by some, given its mostly Russian crew and language used, with Konchalovsky being mentioned on this channel previously during the series on Tarkovsky's Mirror. Curiously, the film was shot by the great cinematographer Georgy Herberg, the same director of photography of Mirror and a longtime collaborator of Konchalovsky, and the soundtrack had been composed by Vyacheslav Ovshinnikov, the composer also for Tarkovsky's The Steamroller and the Violin, Ivan's Childhood and Andrei Rublev. In any case, all Russian connotation is overshadowed by the fact that the film is based on a book by the giant of Kyrgyz letters, Chingiz Aytmatov, one of the great literary figures of the century, and it remarkably presents the customs and the landscapes of Kyrgyzstan like no movie had done before, having hence acquired a special place in the nation's cinematic heritage. The latter film, The Sky of Our Childhood, however, is a whole different business, as it marks Tolomush Okeyev's feature film debut, the Kyrgyz director being considered the greatest filmmaker in the country, and his film acknowledged as the best in the country's history. It is an exquisite, precious gem of world cinema comprised of a Kyrgyz crew and cast, spoken almost entirely in Kyrgyz, based on the writings of Chingiz Aytmatov unsurprisingly, with prizes awarded within the Soviet Union and in festivals abroad, and will deservedly have its own dedicated video in the future. A couple of years before The First Teacher and The Sky of Our Childhood, in 1963, there was however already a film that had explored the Kyrgyz identity in a novel manner, one which is occasionally branded as the embryo or seed of the Kyrgyz Golden Age, and whose director incidentally got called the mother of Kyrgyz cinema by the local population while it was being shot. The name of this work is Aптап in Kyrgyz, or Зной in Russian, as it is more commonly known, which can be translated as Ardent Heat, but internationally it has been labeled simply as Heat and was directed by none other than Larisa Shepitko, the talented Ukrainian Soviet director, which you may have heard already about if you've watched the previous video on 10 anti-war films, featuring her 1977 magnificent work The Ascent. Larisa Shepitko had studied at the prestigious and recurrently mentioned VGIK Film School in Moscow, briefly on the studio of Alexander Dovzhenko, perhaps the greatest Ukrainian director in history, and despite his death only 18 months after her arrival, the influence of her fellow countryman and tutor was personally recognized and clearly shows in her film too. Heat was Shepitko's graduation project from the Cinematography Institute and was based on a short story by Chingiz Aytmatov, who else, named Camel's Eye, with the director having faced extreme adversities during its shooting. In frequent temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius, the thin and fragile young lady that the Kyrgyz actors likened to a Russian birch tree was strong-willed and persisted in shooting with manic tenacity every take for as long as she could. After falling ill with jaundice, she was put on an infectious hut but continued directing, being brought to the set in a stretcher. At some point, Russian director Ellen Klimov was sent to help Larisa with the production, and the two would later become husband and wife, with Ellen taking the reins on the editing stage too after they returned to Moscow whenever she was too weak to do it, as she remained afflicted by the unhealed ailment for a long period still. The film's plot revolves around Kemel, an idealistic, enthusiastic and proactive member of the Komsomol, the youth division of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, that has just finished school and arrives in Anarchai to help develop its raw and unfarmed Wormwood steppe in an attempt to convert its lands into pastures as part of the Virgin Lands campaign of 1953 to 1964, which represented an effort to cultivate thousands of acres in Siberia and Kazakhstan. The operation already at work in there is comprised of a small group of Kyrgyz farmers led by Abakir, a tractor driver and former Stakhanovit, a label attributed to workers in the Soviet Union that outperformed all others and were exceptionally productive and hardworking, commonly resulting in some notorious, if short-lived fame, and typically branded with trivial material indulgences by the state, who in turn used them as propaganda symbols to instill a selfless working ethic throughout the nation. Kemel is youthful, energetic, resilient, if somewhat naive and unexperienced, being ironically designated as academician, whereas Abakir is skilled, strict, uncompromising, albeit disillusioned, cynical, rude and intolerant, having a beguiled young lady of astounding beauty named Kalipa fallen head over heels for him, one who unfortunately often takes the brunt of his ill-disposed temper. Therefore, the stage is set for a clash of disparate personalities, two worlds and approaches that struggle to take the upper hand, whilst the remaining group attempts to manage disharmony and avoid the sparks flying from the friction surging between the characters. Although Kemel may be no match for the physically imposing Abakir, his faith and drive inspires him to strive and resist against the selfish and occasionally cruel tractor driver, with Aitmatov's prose and Shepitko's direction highlighting the ideological and perhaps even spiritual fight that unravels amidst the two protagonists, the scene when Abakir drives Kemel through the dust released by the furrowing steppe acting as one of the defining moments of triumphant tenacity. Despite that, there is no grating linearity in the typical fashion of the expendable social realism tradition, with the film allowing space for Kemel to adopt his own certainties and adapt or reconfigure his method, for Abakir to exhibit moments of conflicting disposition and longing in between his bouts of disdain and egotism, and for Kalipa to reassess her compliant attitude and to display emotional growth in the path of self-reflection. Visually, the film is remarkable in its effort to capture the scorching atmosphere and wondrous landscape of Anarchai, and specifically dust takes a particular significance in constituting one of the main axes of the steppe's materiality, sometimes even occluding the spectator's eyesight and rendering the action almost illegible, therefore bringing a vivid sense of the harsh environmental circumstances of the enterprise. By making great use of wide shots that in typical Shepitko fashion push the characters to confront their minute scale against the extended backdrops, often in a silent, pensive mood, the cinematography acquires a lyricism of uncanny efficacy, whilst often coming across as tense, soulful, gripping, riddled with psychological insight and comprised of various dynamic shots that reveal the inventive and restless creative fervor of Shepitko's film language, a focused exercise in clothing the thoughts and action with a purposeful visual outline. Audiences, therefore, may witness for example a bright roving sequence with the camera rolling around and beneath the overheating tractor with Kemel, as he searches fruitlessly for the release valve whilst sharply teased by Abakir. On more than one occasion, the camera organically blends background and foreground action, showcasing Shepitko's aesthetic layering and storytelling sensibility with great effect, aptly working as proof of the artist's talent and her institution's training. In other instances, the film displays many a creative decision and cinematographic traits that confer to it an authorial flair and highly stimulating viewing, such as when the camera adopts subjective perspective through Kemel's point of view, or when it simply lays back in observational demeanor through a static but carefully composed long take during an outdoors conversation, or when it captures the setting's fauna in a way reminiscent of Dovzhenko's pantheistic flavor, Larisa's influential tutor, or through the use of an assorted plethora of canted shots in a variety of instances to emphasize the mood. Arguably, the film is successful and efficient in telling its story, not only because of the literary merit of the original work and its adaptation and portrayal from a technical and aesthetic standpoint, but also due to its persuasive cast performances, with none other than Bolotebek Shamshiev at the forefront playing Kemel, which, as has been mentioned a few moments ago, became one of the main figures in Kyrgyz filmmaking, and in here presents his first and only actor role at mere 22 years old, and just 6 years away from his first feature film as director, A Shot at Karash Pass. Nurmurkhan Janturin, a Kazakh actor, plays the antagonist Abakir with his disenchantment and fierce narrow-mindedness in a striking manner, no doubt fruit of his extensive theater acting experience started in the early 50s, with Janturin eventually transitioning fully into film performances and becoming a highly successful and an instantly recognizable Kazakh star and icon. Kalipa, the young woman infatuated with Abakir and hopelessly caught in his deceitful web of charming virility and manhood, is marvelously portrayed by the Kyrgyz actress Klara Yusupsanova, a lady of uncanny and hypnotic beauty, conceived as a well-natured and kind farmer whose passion towards Abakir places her in a contradictory nature against herself, facing moral dilemmas that visibly lacerate her within. Like Bolotebek, Klara has her acting debut in this film and would go on to work with Andrei Konchalovsky in the film The First Teacher, mentioned earlier, and other films throughout the 60s and 70s, but she also turned to directing and achieved renown with several of her poetic documentaries. The remaining cast, consisting of a small group of individuals, all provide an additional level of dramatic contextualization for the plot, but in their apparent submission to the authoritarian Abakir, they still manage to shine subtly each on their own, with their visible empathy and humanity channeled as the main duo confronts, hinting clearly at their own suppressed emotions, hopes, fears, joys and experiences, with a particular episode that more evidently discloses that, when the group gathers around the Stakhanovich Prize awarded to Abakir, his awe-inducing radio recently fixed by Kemal, their only link to civilization at that point in time. Heat is a work of great significance for Kyrgyz cinema, as it is one of the first productions by the studio Kyrgyzfilm that attained wide recognition in the Soviet Union, with awards in various festivals and a cast of substantial Kyrgyz composition. It is acknowledged nowadays as the seed for the ingenious wave of Kyrgyz cinema that would follow in its wake. Expect an exploration of the Kyrgyz golden age of cinema in further detail in future videos on this channel. This video was made possible by the support of Kyrgyzfilm National Film Studio, named Tolomush Okeyev, and by the Department of Cinematography of the Ministry of Culture, Information, Sports and Youth Policy of Kyrgyzstan. Please visit their websites for additional information, links will be on the description. Thank you for listening and see you next time.